Haven't used. It looks like ryegrass seed. It looks really.
Does it have a tag on the bottom there?
No, they made a mistake.
Okay.
Sorry. We're using white proso millet as our main grain of choice. We might have a little ryegrass seed. We'll experiment with that next time. Sometimes mistakes like that, though, end up being like huge successes. Well, that happened to me once with the millet. Or one time I went to go pick up some Milo, and ended up with some of this millet, and ended up using it, and I really like it better. It has a really small grain, so you get really a lot more inoculation points when you use it to inoculate your substrate. There's our white proso millet. You can use a multitude of grains to cultivate your spawn, ranging from millet, which is my most desirable. We've also used soft red winter wheats or other various wheats, rye grain, basically whole rye berries. Also, another favorite of mine is Milo or sorghum. It makes a great grain. You get these nice spherical grains. But millet, I found, is the optimum one. I mean, you can really stretch your spawn further with it.
I've seen people online using
Oats.
Uncle Ben's rice.
So, yeah, we'll just take a scoop of this grain and we'll weigh it out. As you get higher in the volume or bigger containers, you want to kind of decrease in the moisture content of your grain spawn. Like a smaller quart jar, I'll shoot for maybe a 50% moisture content as opposed to these 38% content ratios with these bigger bags. It'll be a 6-pound bag, so basically some simple math, 38% of the 6 pounds, and we have our moisture content. The reason why I like this method of producing grain spawn as well is because it's really little to no waste. All the water that we're using and all the grain gets added and sterilized, and we're not wasting any water. There's other methods where grain is required to be soaked for 24 hours, and then after that it's rinsed repeatedly until the water runs clear. And then after that, grain is laid to dry out on the table until you get the desired moisture content, after which it's placed in your sterilizers and sterilized. I found that method works well, especially with smaller batches, but you use a lot of resources. A lot of water will get used for the rinsing of the grain. So now we're gonna start adding water into our bags. And we'll just pour it into this kind of like a pour pitcher bowl, and that will make it easier to get the water into the bag. So we'll just set that aside. And as we keep working, we'll let those grains start absorbing that moisture. Yep, so yeah, liquid culture will get poured into here, or wedges from our petri dish will be transferred into here. And yeah, after that, full colonization usually takes about 2 weeks. So all these seeds will be covered in a white mass organism called Mycelium. And then from there, we could break it up and pour little bits of this grain spawn into blocks of sterilized wood-based substrate. Each little seed becomes a vehicle to carry the mycelium into our substrate and basically acts as an inoculation point from which mycelium can start to grow and reach for new food sources. So yeah, one bag can become 200 to 300 production blocks, or you can even keep expanding it further. Turn this one bag into 10, those 10 into 100. Those 100 bags inoculate 20 to 30 production blocks. Now you're at 3,000 blocks from just one single wedge of tissue. So this is required to grow out the mycelium, basically in a nutrient grain-based substrate. And also, each little seed acts as a carrier for the mycelium onto our sawdust. Everything has to be sterilized pre-inoculation, so we kill off any basically endospores, mold spores, or bacterial contaminants that can also compete with our mushroom mycelium's precious food source. So yeah, Without grain spawn, it'd be really hard to grow these mushrooms. If you were to take just liquid culture and pour it directly into sawdust instead of using grain spawn, then the sawdust really doesn't have enough nutrients to allow the mycelium to really take off onto the sawdust. So that's why the grain spawn comes in handy. You'll notice when inoculating the grain spawn, usually within 24 to 48 hours, you've already noticed the mycelium has started to grow onto the sawdust. When using liquid spawn, that's not the case. Usually it takes a long time, if any, to show any growth. And since there's such a lack in nutrients to really start the mycelium off on the right foot, then you can have a higher chance of contamination, and the yield will be very low. The mushrooms utilize this grain spawn for its nutrients, so it enables us to get a really good flush off of these production blocks. We target, 3 to 5 pounds of mushrooms on our first flush, and that's due to the recipe that we use or the formula. Without that, our yields would be very low and almost not worth it for the cost and everything to produce. So that's why using the correct spawn for the correct substrate or liquid media or whatever is really important. I'll inoculate some shiitake blocks with a bag of grain spawn, and that'll basically be like a first generation production block for me. And then I can take it a step further and I'll label these blocks like a G2. It's a generation 2 shiitake block. That means I've taken a production block that has been inoculated with grain spawn, broke it up, and used it to inoculate 10 more blocks. So each of those is labeled G2. That tells me when I'm going through my incubation area that, oh, this block has been inoculated with sawdust. I can't really inoculate, I can't use this to expand into more blocks. This has to go into fruiting. So I don't want to take it past the second generation of spawn. I could very well take it past this and keep on going for another 10 blocks. The only thing is my yields would dramatically start to decrease. I mean, right now I'm going to be averaging 2.5 pounds per block right here. If I take it another step further, I'm probably going to be looking at 1.75 pounds per block. So it's up to you. If you really want to keep it going and you have the space and room to really just keep on expanding this mycelium, you can very well, weigh out your options and what's going to be the most rewarding for you. So yeah, I usually just take it to generation 2, and then these will become our fruiting blocks to go into our grow rooms, and we can get a good amount of mushrooms from these. Their shiitake mushrooms take about 8 to 12 weeks before we put them in our grow room. It takes longer than most of our mushrooms. Most of our mushroom species usually are about 2 to 3 weeks, and we can start fruiting them. Specifically like oyster mushrooms, 2 weeks, and they're basically ready to go. Anytime after 2 weeks, and then I kind of start becoming a little concerned if everything's okay. Kind of like with plants and how you plant a seed to get a crop to grow, this is very well the case for our grain spawn for our mushrooms. This kind of acts as the seed for our mushrooms, as well as a jump start of really good nutrients to boost up mycelial growth and yield. This starts out as a food source for our mycelium, but once the mushroom mycelium has completely colonized your grain spawn, it becomes the seeds for the mushrooms to grow. So you utilize this as an inoculum, pouring little bits of it into different production blocks, or each production block. In the end, this will end up being 30 production blocks for us, each harvesting around 2 to 3 pounds. So one bag of grain spawn, 30 production blocks, about 90 pounds, 60 to 90 pounds of mushrooms. Or we can just keep expanding and turn this into 10 bags of grain spawn and 300 blocks, and yeah, just keep going. Really, there's no stopping the mycelium. It's always hungry. So everything that gets inoculated straight from the petri dish is a G1, generation 1. That means it's the first transfer away from the plate. And then if I use this to grain, which is a common term, it means transferring grains to new grains, that would be a generation 2. And I really like to stay at around generation 2. I don't like to go past it. So our grain spawn has been basically all the appropriate ingredients are added. We have our grain, we have our water, we've added a little bit of gypsum to prevent our grains from sticking after sterilization, making it more easier to shake. So we're gonna let these bags soak for the next day until tomorrow morning. We'll let them soak overnight. We'll fold them up like we are now. And we'll come back in the morning before we load these into our pressure steam sterilizers. And we'll actually unwrap them. We'll shake them again to redistribute any moisture in these bags. And then at that point we can load them in our sterilizer and sterilize them for 4 hours between 15 to about 15 psi, 15 to 20 psi. After that 4 hours, we will allow them to cool overnight in our laboratory and commence the inoculation process the day after. So Friday, these will be inoculated with fresh tissue culture or petri dishes or liquid culture.